Hey, it's Rachel, and I wanted to let you know that if you find this podcast remotely interesting and helpful, then I ask that you please subscribe and share it with others. This is really just a passion project for me. It's an outlet for me to share what I am learning, which I really enjoy, and I would love it if it's actually helpful to people. So if you could please subscribe and share, it would make my wildest dreams come true. Thank you. All right, on to the episode. Microphone check, microphone check. Hey, what's up? This is Rachel Cancino-Neal, health restoration coach and nutritional therapy practitioner in training. Derek is up to his eyeballs at work this week, so I will be flying solo for portions of this episode. Liz will be joining me in the coffee shop talk segment to discuss grief. I do want to give my family members a heads up that I will be talking about the loss of family members within our own family, so you may or may not want to tune in for this particular episode. With that said, I invite you, dear listeners, to allow this episode to do what it needs to do for you, whatever that might look like. All right, you ready? Let's do this. Our topic for today, grief, is quite a vulnerable topic. And I'm just letting you know right now that I am going to get quite vulnerable in my discussion when I have it with Liz in our coffee shop talk segment. Before we get into all of that, you know that I like to do review so that you can remember a few key points that we've actually already covered in previous episodes. And we do that because I want your minds to be ready to receive even more, because you know I like to share information. So since Derek isn't here to take my awesome quiz, you all get to fly solo, just like I'm flying solo right now. So we can be in this together, okay? Let's see how you do. The nervous system has two main divisions for responses. You have a voluntary side, which would move things like your skeletal muscles. Then you have the automatic side, which are things that we don't really think about or can't always influence, okay? Automatic movements respond in two different ways. One is a sympathetic or fight or flight response. Can you tell me the other response? Do 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 do. If you are thinking parasympathetic, congratulations, that is parasympathetic. The sympathetic side of responses, that are the fight or flight responses. And then we also have the parasympathetic, which is our rest and digest. A couple other names that you could use instead, though, that I think it will be a little more clearer as we discuss what we're talking about today. We can say that the sympathetic responses rev us up. Parasympathetic responses slow us down. So when we're talking about rest and digest responses, or these slow down responses, this largely depends on the vagus nerve to carry out the functions. If you remember, the vagus nerve connects to many different organs, including the heart and lungs, but it also connects to our digestive organs. Hence, when you are stressed, and you're experiencing stress of any kind, digestion can be impacted because fight or flight, or those rev up, counters rest and digest, also known as our slow down responses. Okay? And so more than likely, if you've been revved up for a while, you'll see your digestion change and you might have more digestive complaints. Okay? That's what happens because that fight or flight goes against rest and digest. So we have talked about one of the things that can be a stressful part on our nervous system is trauma. And Liz gave us the definition from last time that trauma is anything that overwhelms the nervous system's ability to cope. So this can be something that's a really big event, or it can be a smaller event, or it can be ongoing. But again, it's anything that overwhelms the nervous system's ability to cope. Okay, so that could mean that any traumatic event has the potential to leave lingering effects, as we talked about in the previous episodes. So if you missed that, go back to that episode so you can hear all the different symptoms that you might see if you have experienced a traumatic event, and to tell whether or not some signs that you might be in still a traumatic state. Another stressor that we may not always think about is the stressor of grief. Grief actually revs up our bodies or puts us in that sympathetic state. And grief can be defined, I was listening to this book called Before and After Loss, and it defined grief as deep sorrow, anything that is deeply felt, that is tormenting, and it's actually very active. So when we're talking about grief, that's the ideas, that's the feelings, that's the emotions, those are that deep sorrow, that tormenting, it's active. That's what we're going to keep in our minds as we're talking about grief. So grief can actually be brought on through different events. It could be the obvious one of when somebody that you know and love dies. It could be the loss. It can be grieving over the loss of a healthier childhood if yours was chaotic or dysfunctional. It could be grieving when your world turns upside down because an unexpected change has happened, and that more or less has impacted your identity or your personhood. Okay, so Liz will be joining me as we talk more about this and unpack this. And like I said, I'm going to be vulnerable with you as I share my experiences, because I have experienced and am experiencing these different kinds of grief. And the reason why I'm going to share this with you is because I want any of you who are walking through grief right now, or maybe it's happened in the past and you're more on the healed side of it. But I want you to know that you're seen, you are heard, and I want you to feel known. Even if I can't see you, I can't hear you, and I don't know you, what I'm hoping for is that this conversation will give you the freedom to accept the grief, and not fight against it, and see it as an opportunity for you to actually heal and grow. And we're going to cover how that can happen. Okay, so I want you to take a deep breath before we really get into this. And here we go. All right, to prepare for our conversation today, I did listen to the book called Before and After Loss, a Neurologist's Perspective on Loss, Grief, and Our Brain. That's by Dr. Elisa Shulman. And I definitely encourage anybody out there to listen to it or read it, because she is a really talented writer. And it was a great book. So Liz is joining me right now. Say hello, Liz.
What's up?
Okay, you may be going the red. Told you.
Wait, I'm in the red?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, we turned it up to too many decibels. It's okay, I was intending for you to edit that out anyways. We don't even. What's up? Thank you for having me. No.
This is all being kept.
No, it's not.
This is really. We're gonna need some humor in this one, because we're talking about some serious stuff today. So I'm glad you're back to help this conversation. And since we both I'll say for me, I get more giggly the more awkward a conversation gets. So it should be good. It should be good. And I'm happy you did agree to have this conversation, because we've known each other for a while, and we've both been through stuff together and far apart, and then back together again. So I thought it'd be good for you to be here. So, okay, I am feeling a little self-conscious, because right before this, Liz did tell me that I suck at vulnerability.
I didn't say that. Rachel, you're reframing in a negative way.
Okay. Liz says I'm uncomfortable with vulnerability.
I didn't say that either, but you are, so we'll keep it.
So here's what I'm going to tell you. I think I've already said I'm going to be vulnerable with you. And I am going to be comfortably vulnerable, meaning I am no longer going through emotional intensity of which I was going through. So I am okay with sharing these things with you now.
That's healthy.
Moral of the story. The point is to share stuff from basically the book. The Before and After Loss is like the main reference point for a lot of these things. But we are going to talk about our personal things. Well, I'm going to be talking about my personal. I don't know if Liz is. but I'll be sharing my personal experiences with grief of different sorts. And yes, so
Yeah.
okay. Well, I've already mentioned this before about the definition of grief, but when we are thinking about grief throughout this conversation, I want you to be thinking about what Dr. Shulman says about it. And she says, grief is a deep sorrow related to a loss. It's active and tormenting, which that tormenting part is very uncomfortable, but it's very true. It is very tormenting. So in a very vulnerable for her, and maybe hers was a controlled vulnerability, I'm assuming she was willing to share it. Dr. Shulman, in her book, she's very open and vulnerable and really invites you as the reader into not only the grief of her husband dying, but also the journey toward that as he was battling with cancer for 18 months. And so she writes the book in a way that's more like a memoir. And then she also gives like the scientific parts for it, which is nice because it kind of gives, for me, somebody who doesn't always like to dive into those things, a relief of, oh, here's some good scientific information, some facts to help kind of cope with what's going on. So I thought she did a really good job with that. So one thing she does point out in the book that I think is worth mentioning is that traumatic grief and or emotional trauma actually have the same brain injuring effects as a physical brain injury. Right? And so I think it's really important to acknowledge, because if you want to be able to heal, you have to recognize, and I'm preaching to myself right now, you have to recognize what emotional trauma does to your brain. And there is an injury that has occurred, right? Have you heard of that before? Like where your brain is basically like been injured because of what past events have been?
Yes, I have heard of that before, that the effects are essentially the same as a traumatic brain injury. Not that all traumatic brain injuries are the same.
Right.
But I've heard it before. I think this is the first time I heard it highlighted in the context of grief, though.
Yeah.
Like I normally think of it in terms of just general trauma or PTSD. Yeah. And we don't always associate grief with PTSD or trauma.
Right. And that part of the book that she's talking about that is with complicated grief. So that one that's prolonged, and it's normally attached to that traumatic event. And so PTSD and complicated grief share those brain injuring effects together, which is also important to know.
I think that associating your grief as physical brain injury can maybe be relieving for some people.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's another one of those things we've kind of talked about when we dismiss how we're feeling. Grief is definitely a thing that people can be dismissive about. So realizing that there are genuine physical effects going on, I think can be really a freeing knowledge.
Right. Well, she actually does have a chapter dedicated to talking more about that, and she talks about the wounded mind, and she said from a neurologist standpoint, that totally makes sense to her, and explains that it's really reasonable to actually consider a person who's going through grief, complicated grief, if there's been trauma attached to it, to see them through the lens of somebody who has been, like you would as if somebody has been physically injured.
Yeah.
And so, you know, when we have somebody who's been through like a physical injury, let's say they broke their leg, right? Like we're very understanding there's going to be limitations. You know, you're there to help. You know, understand that there's certain mile markers that you need to see to make sure that person's leg is growing, developing and progressing toward healing. But there's also like red flags, like if there's infections, if there's like re-injuries, if there's things going on that are showing things that, something bad is happening. So she says that's actually really good if you can consider that and have a similar mindset to when people are going through the grieving process, that we can see, just not put it in the category of like mental health or emotional thing, but I understand like physically their brains have been altered. There's been physical changes within their brain, right? And so when we see somebody who has been emotionally wounded, they are more than likely going to encounter limitations, right? And so when we consider a physical injury, we look for things of like gain of mobility, if there's less pain, if there's like alleviation from symptoms. From Dr. Shulman's point of view, if we can carry that sort of mindset into somebody who's gone through emotional trauma and now experiencing grief through that, then it might be easier to have compassion and grace and just know like kind of give us a barometer to see if is this person leaning toward healing or leaning toward more issues?
Right.
You know what I mean?
Like, are they in the injury, essentially?
Yes. Are they going to stay in the injury, or are there any kind of signs that they're making their way toward this, even if they're not there? And it's probably going to be a long time before they are there. But are they just? Do you see those signs that positive progression is being made?
Which I think is one of the things in the book that she touches on so well.
Yeah.
Is some of the myths about like that you might see as a red flag that are actually just part of the healing process.
Yes.
Like positive dissociation.
Yes.
Things like that.
Yes. I thought that was very interesting, that dissociation actually is a protective mechanism. Yeah. That's totally appropriate. And it's your body's way of saying, well, I can't deal with this right now. And yeah, if you linger, if you stay there, we don't want that. But like temporarily, however that is, how long that is, you know, is good. For me, that really did make a lot of sense, and like you're saying, it can be helpful to people. It's definitely helpful to me to know, like, oh, okay, so this is why my brain sometimes just does not work properly because of the different things I've walked through surrounding different events that have led to, you know, grief. That okay, sometimes my brain has a really hard time talking. Like the integration element is not always great. So it actually also, before we started recording, Liz and I were talking about shame and how much shame I live with. And I think it's interesting, as I was preparing this episode, like realizing how much shame I actually had surrounding grief. Is that like a common thing? Is for people to have, just like in my experience, or you personally, like when you're like, okay, for example, I'm gonna get into the story in a moment, but after my brother died, I really didn't want to be around people, and because it irritated me because everybody was moving on with life. Not that everybody's life was gonna be affected because they didn't know him, but also I didn't know if they were gonna ask me a question that was gonna make me start crying. And I knew if I started crying, I wasn't going to be able to control myself. So it was better to just, you know, kind of deal with it by myself. In my mind, it was better to deal with it by myself.
To be vulnerable in front of people.
Especially if it was like a random person, you know, like, you know what I mean? But I can hear like certain mindsets of like, I should be over this by now. You know, for me, I didn't see my brother every single day. I talked to him weekly, but I didn't see him every single day, so I probably shouldn't grieve in the same way that my mom would be grieving. You know, this kind of stuff where it would be almost like, well, I don't have it as bad as this person, so why should I be grieving about this? Yeah. You know, so I would think that's pretty common, maybe.
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'm not a weirdo. I'm not a weirdo.
No.
Okay, good.
No, not at all. And I think I feel like I bring it back to this a lot, but this is kind of our context here. I mean, it's mine and your context, but especially in Christian culture, we can really have some strong spoken and unspoken like beliefs about grief, especially if the person is saved. There's like this kind of thing about like you shouldn't even be grieving.
Right.
You should be celebrating.
There's that verse in the Bible that says that those who, I can't remember the exact wordage, but Paul talks about like we shouldn't grieve like the pagans grieve, you know, because we know what is in store.
Yes. You know, and I think that gets taken to such an extreme though, because grief is obviously also throughout the Bible and God grieved. Jesus grieved. And he knew the guy was coming back to life. In reference to Lazarus. Sorry, that is confusing.
Just wanted to make sure we're on the same page.
Lazarus.
I'm kind of jumping the gun here. I think I was going to start talking about it in a moment, but when you're talking about the Christian perspective and how often it kind of gets like muddled with that, there was 2 books that I thought were really helpful. A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis was very freeing to me because he was very blunt. And, C.S. Lewis is considered one of these great philosophers of the faith, philosophers period, but then like of the faith. And he's very plain with what his struggles were and kind of the things that he would hear from Christians of like, oh, she's in a better place. And he just really calls that into question. Like, we really don't know. We really don't know what happens right after death. The Bible gives us pictures and stuff, but from him just lamenting about these things, he was just, he was very plain in his struggle with it. And I was very appreciative of that. And the other book, too, was called Lamenting for a Son. And I can't remember who wrote that book. But this man's son died in a climbing accident. He went to, I can't remember where, but he was climbing a mountain and he fell and he died. And so this man's a Christian, too, and he talked about the awkwardness of as being a Christian and somebody you love dies and, like, that struggle of, like, and it makes even conversations with God really awkward. And he talks about, and I appreciated him just being very blunt of like, there's a strained relationship that can occur afterwards with not just with God, but like with people around you who are Christians. It's a very straining kind of thing.
Can I tell you something interesting I learned recently about A Grief Observed? Was that when it was originally published, C.S. Lewis published it under a pseudonym. So he didn't even want people to know that it was him.
Shame.
Right? I was like, maybe he had some shame about it or some awkwardness or some fear.
Well, I was sure because, again, he was like...
Because he was so blunt.
Yeah. He was very blunt. And, again, when I read it, I was so happy. So it's crazy that, it almost would have been unnamed, like, wow. Because it did bring up the fact that C.S. Lewis is struggling with these same things. Right. Okay.
That ended up being probably way more powerful.
Oh, way more, especially because his reputation. Yeah. Right? So definitely. So today we're not just going to be talking about this kind of grief that comes from the effects or after you've lost somebody that you loved, but we're also going to be talking about childhood, if you've grown up in like either dysfunction or it's been chaotic or emotionally void. So not necessarily bad, but like emotions weren't,
maybe neglected.
Maybe neglected emotionally, and maybe even like a dangerous childhood. Looking at how that can actually bring out grief, those feelings of grief. Yeah. And then also unexpected life changes, either that started with trauma or didn't start with trauma, but either way, that you're more than likely your identity was somehow challenged. And either you had to like give up what you thought who you were, right? Or you had to go through like this defining moment in your life. So I'm going to kick off more, and not really kick off because we've already been kind of into it, but this is where I'm going to share more about my experience with it, and Liz is going to just jump in as need be. So, all right, here we go. Okay, so we're talking about when someone that you love passes, and that can come through so many different avenues. I realized as I was preparing this particular episode, my most consistent exposure to the death of a loved one has been actually a very slow process. Been like some types of degenerative diseases that have slowly taken them away. The slow process, in my mind, there's actually a grieving process in and of itself as you're watching this person that you have known, and like they're changing right before your eyes, and they're not gone, but yet they're not them either. Right. And so they don't look like themselves anymore. They don't sound like themselves. Nothing about them, like it's a stranger essentially sitting in front of you, right? Or you're talking to on the phone. Right. And would you agree that that is a part of the grieving? Like that's a almost separate grieving process, right?
Yeah. I've known some people who have walked with a loved one who passed away like slowly from a disease, and probably felt like most of their grieving happened during that process. And the death was almost like a relief. Right. Because the pain was over, or was a relief. Yeah. I had an uncle die from AIDS, and I was the family member who was available at the time to be with him through most of those last months of his life. And so I definitely had that experience also. Not just watching him physically change, but like he lose his mind, but like mentally, like becoming way less themselves. Yeah, can't really have a conversation with them in the same way and things like that. Yeah, and so it is definitely you grieve each loss as it comes along. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting that it didn't even occur to me that was a grieving process until I was already in this episode. Yeah. I didn't even. I mean, it just. I don't even remember. So like my grandparents, both my mom's parents had a death that was very slow. My grandma specifically had cancer that was all over her body. Finally made its way to her brain, and at that stage, it was like, this is no longer. We called her Wita. I'm like, this is not Wita, and like. So even now, as I'm saying it, the flashbacks that I have are of that Wita, which really sucks, you know? So like, I have to work to have those other memories of those happy memories come through, because the last part of Wita is what I immediately recall, which sucks, which really sucks. Yeah. So maybe there's some healing actually that needs to happen there. Yeah. So there was various experiences like that, but the most, for sure, the most traumatic and the most intense was when my brother died. In December 30th, 2018. That one was, I mean, obviously it was my brother. And it's not like we were super tight. He lived in Arizona. I live in Missouri. And so I didn't see him all the time, but pretty regularly we would talk on the phone and stuff. But kind of his backstory before I get into that part. My brother was born, healthy, and my mom would say, probably looking back, there may have been some stuff, red flags, but from what we could tell, he was a healthy kid. He was, I want to say, like 4 or 5 years older than I was. And so starting around the age of 12, he started having, he went from healthy, rarely sick, full of energy, to having grand mal epileptic seizures. And what that means is that he would just drop and shake violently. Yeah. And the first seizure he had was at around 12, and we were sharing a room at that time, so I witnessed the first seizure, and I thought he was just being an idiot. And I was like, Phil, shut up, what are you doing? Yeah. And so I was like, I'm gonna go tell mom. And so he went stop, and then I can't remember it may be like early morning or something, but I remember looking over and just like, what is happening? And so I went and got my mom, and then my mom had absolutely no idea what was going on. And so we were living in a townhouse in the ghetto of Phoenix, and my mom tries to carry my brother, who was, much bigger than her. Again, she had no idea. She just thought, I need to get him downstairs. And so she takes him downstairs. We call the paramedics, and they come. And so I don't think any of us knew. How could you? That, about 23 years later, that this would eventually, in an indirect way, take his life, Yeah. So his story, I have memories of him being quote unquote normal, where he taught me how to ride a bike, and I can remember him and my oldest brother, like we would play football inside the house, and so I have like a lot of these memories, and honestly a lot of my happy memories are from way back there. Yeah. Once the seizure started happening, he had to get on heavy doses of medication, and so that slow process of watching my brother change was years in the making. Right. So as he was getting older and his seizures started getting way worse, at one point they had to put him in coma in the hospital, because every time they brought him out, he would start seizing again. And so he was having I don't even know, 30 plus seizures. There were specialists from everywhere looking on his case. Nobody could figure out, because normally seizures, there's a starting point somewhere. And for him, it was like an entire brain activity. And so when I was my senior year in college, they did a brain surgery on him. and I was doing my student teaching at the time for elementary ed, and he had that brain surgery, and that was supposed to help him, and he still continued having seizures, and all the while he's having these really intense medications that, I mean, there were some of them that he was like having hallucinations. I can remember one time his like anger was it was like really bad. He would run away a lot. I mean, it was so intense. And so when they did the brain surgery, it affected areas of his brain that would do like the thinking side of the brain. So his emotional brain was pretty high. Medications he was on was shrinking his cerebellum, so his balance was becoming awful. And then on top of that, his thinking side of his brain was going down. And so they said, you probably will never see, like, he will never be who you knew before.
Wow.
All in the hopes of just stopping these seizures. And so it was probably 2 or 3 Christmases before he died that I remember visiting Arizona with Derek, visiting my family out there. And if somebody had warned me how bad Phil looked, I wasn't paying attention. But I remember seeing him, and it was like his hair was so thin. He had gained so much weight. He was like his speech. That's the point. His thinned hair and his speech was so bad. And it would take him so long to get out like a really basic sentence. And I was just sitting there just looking at my brother and thinking, this is not my brother. Like this is not him. And honestly, it drove me nuts. It's the being vulnerable, and it's good, and I'm confessing here, but it drove me absolutely crazy. Like, what the heck? He can't even talk. This is so annoying. Why can't he talk? Even though I knew why he couldn't talk, it was just. So there was like frustration that I couldn't even have a conversation with him, and then there's the frustration of like, this isn't even my brother anymore. Like, who is this? And so like now, of course, had I known all the how things would progress, I would love to be sitting here and having to wait 10 minutes for a 3-word sentence.
Right.
But it just, you just don't know. Yeah. So I do remember though, seeing him like that was when I really began to wonder how much longer he would be alive. And I had kind of grappled with the idea, I want to say back in high school when his seizures started really getting more serious, that I thought, I'm going to lose my brother. Like, he's going to be young. He's going to be young. And he was 35 when he did die. Yeah. And just at that that particular Christmas where I saw him just looking like this, I was just like, man, I think that's going to be, the seizures are going to kill him. And so fast forward a couple years later, probably 2-3 years later, my son's first birthday happened, and we did 2 celebrations, one in Missouri with family here, and then we flew out to Arizona, and Derek and I had the idea, and I'm so glad we had this idea. I think it was the Lord like whispering, you're gonna really want to do this. So we hosted a bowling party, because my family's mostly adults at this point, and so like everybody, I mean, we had a ton, like probably about 30 people, aunts, uncles, like extended family, like people came and celebrated, and Phil was there, and that, like, he looked so great that day, and like he was actually able to bowl, and again, because of the medication, his cerebellum had just like shrunk up so much that his balance, like he had to, like, my mom would have like a strap that she would, when he lived with somebody who was trained and stuff, but when he would come out, he would wear a strap, and so my mom could help balance him and whatnot. But he was like able to stand, and he was like bowling, and like, so this is in July of 2018. So all of us were gathered around. There was no way that we could have known 6 months later we were all gathered around again. He had a pulmonary embolism, so he even died of a freaking seizure, which is what I was anticipating. He died of a pulmonary embolism. And so I know that, first I am very thankful that the whole, I honestly, I can't remember who all was, there were a lot of our family members that were there for Jaden's first birthday, and I'm so glad for that. And then, I'm so glad that we have that moment in time that was celebratory, and then 6 months later we're back together for a totally different reason. And so yeah, so 6 months later, things tanked pretty fast. He had gone through another brain surgery. I think it was December 10th. It was a 2-step process. And during that time in the hospital, he had developed a blood clot and it had dislodged. And my mom was not there at the hospital with him, which she was like always there at the hospital with him. But she and my stepdad were taking us out to the airport to fly back to Missouri.
Yeah.
And so we were at the airport when we found out. And so my mom was not there. And I honestly think that was God's grace that she didn't see. I don't know if they did resuscitation or whatever. But
yeah.
So all that to say, we come back to the hospital. And so there was a very, very tough decision that my mom had to make. And most of my family was there. People came from all over to be there in that hospital room. Needless to say, very traumatic. And because I know words can be very offensive, I will filter, but I was effing pissed that this was happening. And the reason was because I was convinced. I mean, I felt in my bones that God was going to heal him. There was several times in my life where I can remember in college, calling my mom and be like, you need to tell Phil, it's going to happen. It's going to happen. And guess what? It didn't happen. I know some people are thinking, well, it didn't happen on this side of heaven. And I've heard this statement. I think these are one of those things where C.S. Lewis would be like, let's just pause that statement, because the reality is I wanted him healed here.
Yeah.
That's what I was wanting. So God knew that's what I was wanting.
Right.
And his understanding of life, that wasn't what was going to happen. So like I felt a lot of betrayal and hurt and anger toward God. Like it was unreal how angry I was. I don't know if I've ever been that angry, and like prolonged anger.
Yeah.
That my brother was gone in such a way, and to me it was just so cruel. It was very cruel. Yeah. I wouldn't say that now, but in that time I would definitely say I was not happy. I was very angry. And so I did write about that portion of my grief. That part of my grief's journey. So I am going to link a blog that I had started, and I'm very raw, and I'm very, it's not too extensive, not too overwhelming, I don't think. But it is, if you're going through it and you're like, I'm a Christian and I feel this kind of pissed, well, go read that and maybe you'll feel company, because it wasn't all raw and unfiltered, but it was as close as I could get to it, with not having people just turn away from it, basically. So there was a turning point, though. Can I share that part?
Yeah.
There's good turning. So I am not that pissed off anymore. I am not that hurt. It is. I would be lying if I said it's still not a struggle to understand and to trust God fully. I mean, for me, grief of any sort, I think the reason why it's so hard is because it really breaks down to, like, who are you? Like, I think grief is the fastest way to check your spiritual health.
Oh, yeah.
I think it brings it out, and I think it brings out that question of, if God is so good, then why did that happen? And I think any kind of grief has that same question.
Yeah.
And so I was struggling with that particular question. And through doing the blog, it started kind of opening the doors for a few different things. One thing was, I didn't even realize that I was actually suffering from PTSD for like months, until one night I had woken up by something, and I was like, man, like the flashbacks, I'm back in the hospital, like I'm surrounded by everything, all those stupid machines and all this. Yeah. And so I looked up the symptoms of PTSD, and I was like, oh, frick, I'm experiencing PTSD. Actually, I think I saw PTSD from my childhood too. Didn't know that was happening. So I didn't even, so it's like almost like a gracious act in a weird way that God was like, hey, yeah, you are struggling here, but you've also been struggling this for a while. And so the writing it out through that blog, it just helped me to see things that I was able to like look at the symptoms of what was going on. And then really just come finally to the point. Like, it pretty much gave me an outlet until I was ready to finally get all my nasty out on God. And when I got to that point, when I finally was like, I was actually listening to a Skillet song, Come My Way, I think it was. No, Will You Be There? Oh. Will You Be There? It's an old school song, but I used to listen to it all the time in high school. And it just popped in my head one night. And I put it on, and I was driving home, and I blasted it, and I got home, and I just started sobbing and just like screaming out, like, God, what the heck, man? Like, this is screwed up. And I just really started pouring it all out. But essentially I came to this point where I was so scared. I became so paranoid. I thought Derek was going to die. I would reach over almost nightly to make sure he was still breathing. I was convinced that Jaden was going to die. I was convinced I was getting cancer. I was convinced I was getting a blood clot. Like, I mean, it was a scary, scary time. And on top of that, I did not trust God. Oh my gosh. Yeah. The hypervigilance was really intense. Yeah. And it was like a point where I'm like, I don't even trust you, God, with any of this. So what does that mean?
Right. Where do I go from here?
Where, like this, where do you go? I don't know. Some of you listeners may not believe in God. I don't know. All I know is for me, coming to that place where I can't even trust God, that was too terrifying to me. That was terrifying enough for me to say, I can't stay in this place. I needed to do something. Yeah. And so finally I started, a friend had actually invited me to a Bible study, and I didn't want to go, but I went. And I was on my way home from Bible study, had that Skillet song playing, and finally was able to pour out everything to God. And he totally rescued me. Also realizing that I had been going through PTSD for months, that I wasn't even truly grieving. I was feeling sorrow over my brother's death, and it was tormenting and it was active, as Dr. Shulman describes, but like, I was constantly living in the hospital room. I was constantly living in that moment and hearing the stuff, and I don't want to go through all the stuff, but like, I was hearing the stuff, I was seeing the stuff constantly. That it wasn't even a matter of Phil dying. It was, I don't want to be in that hospital room anymore. And so finally, when I was able to recognize, just able to say, I think I have PTSD. And then keep the blogging going, and then talking to God, and just like being really raw with him, that finally I was like, I miss my brother. And so, I mean, I'm assuming that's kind of normal. Like, if you've been through something traumatic, you have to, I think Dr. Shulman actually talks about that. You have to work through the trauma of everything before like you can truly start grieving what has happened. Yeah, that makes sense to me. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that was my experience, for sure was my experience. And I can actually remember when I started just crying over missing him, and then it was sad, but I was like so happy that I was crying just because I was missing him, not because I was terrified. Right. Yeah. It was different. Totally different. Yeah. So I wanted to share all that, not to necessarily draw attention to myself, but for any listener out there that you walking through it, maybe you are a believer, maybe you're not, you can know grieving is a process, and there's different parts to it, but if you have been through something traumatic, you gotta pay attention to that as well. Right. And then no, you don't have to be stuck there either. Right. So I definitely am not stuck there. Do I have moments? Yes, I have to be very careful with what I watch, what I listen to. I do just want to open the door for anybody else walking through it, that emotional healing can occur, and the emotional intensity can come down, despite something being so intense. Right. So it's like, as we're looking at if we consider the different emotional intensities, right? Be good, I think, to kind of break out. Like for me, recognizing PTSD was important. And so Dr. Shulman goes over this too, but the difference between grief, depression, and anxiety that often go like all together when you're talking about grief. But can you do a rundown of the differences? Yeah. I think you can definitely be experiencing them probably at the same time. It's a good thing to be able to know the difference, though. Depression has a lot of symptoms that would include sadness, which is something you would also experience in grief. But you also tend to
you're going to feel it very physically. Like people with depression tend to just even move slower and have less motivation, less interest in doing things, going anywhere, taking care of themselves or hygiene or leaving bed or, and it is not necessarily associated with a loss though. Like a lot of people struggle with depression.
Right.
Is not necessarily going to be tied to a certain circumstance per se. There can be circumstantial depression.
Right.
It is not always that way. And so you can see how that would be confusing with grief, because I'm sure there's lots of people who are grieving and don't want to get out of bed.
Right.
Don't want to go and do anything.
Right.
So you can be experiencing them at the same time. Anxiety is kind of, you might experience the hypervigilance like you were talking about. Just a fearfulness in general, and also something you probably would feel very physically. Instead of hypoarousal,
right,
you'd feel hyperarousal. Just like a higher heart rate or jitteriness and things like that, and feeling unsettled. Which, you know, with a trauma, when grief includes a trauma, definitely I could see being common. Now, grief can include those things, but it also, and I really love the way this book talked about it. I know you gave the definition earlier: deep sorrow related to a loss, active and tormenting. She also talks about how, like, it might feel really strong at first, and then maybe you grieve, you kind of move on. You start to basically relearn how to live life without that person.
Right.
But you might still experience waves of the same thing.
Right.
And so I think that would probably be easier to differentiate, because depression and anxiety don't come in short-term waves.
Right.
But grief might.
Right.
You might just have that certain trigger and just feel that same deep sorrow or torment. And that's actually very normal to experience.
And she talks about that too, how like that distress, you're like, what's on the neurological standpoint, especially if a person's been part of your identity, right? And you lose them, it's as if truly part of you is dying, because if our nervous systems depend on each other for regulation and for like you help me know who I am, then that person is gone. Like for her, like her husband was gone, you know, and that's, you know, for me, I wouldn't so intertwine with my brother that there was enough, you know, that necessarily wasn't my thing with his death. But yeah, if you have been through that, really your nervous system is like been severed.
Right.
And now you're like, well, what do I do when that person's been so a part of your life?
It definitely affects your functioning in a very real way. And literally your brain has to like relearn.
Right. And kind of tying in with that, what I think is really cool is that grief is awful. Like, you know, any kind of grief is awful, or anything that's like super intense, traumatic. Like it's just intense, and it definitely impacts our nervous systems. But we're talking about like, it can be healed and it can be restored.
Yes, that is the cool part.
That is the cool part. The awfulness of it is not cool, but she talks about this too, and like so many different things that I have read over like the years can confirm it, but I just come back to like, oh, it's been in the Bible the whole time. But just like that restoration process, and actually makes you it can have the potential to make you much more of a grounded person, right? Then when you acknowledge that these things can happen, you have a greater appreciation of life. You understand that no man's guaranteed tomorrow, so therefore I need to change what I maybe do today. You know, and so like you can live with actually greater appreciation and more fulfilled life because you've been through something that has, instead of completely defeating you, it has. I think of that verse in Genesis. I think it's Genesis 50, 50-20 is what I'm thinking. But Joseph's talking to his brothers, they're coming up to him, and he's like, hey, what you intended for evil, God intended for good. And like, even to the point of literally death, that you can walk through that. And biblically and scientifically, you can say both of these things. You can heal from it and you can restore from it.
Yeah.
And I think that's amazing. And my brother's death just highlights that an event that was incredibly traumatic, incredibly hurtful and confusing, and all the things for me has led me down a totally different path, but it's also given me more of understanding for different things. In a weird way, I'm grateful that God has created such an amazing body that He says you will not be stuck. You don't have to be stuck, and therefore it is so.
Right.
we don't have to be stuck. And so we're going to go into more in the section of the segment of what you can do, how to position yourself for what's called post-traumatic growth.
Yes.
Which is
way better than post-traumatic
stress
death.
Disorder. Yeah, right? Yes.
I mean, yes, the clinical term.
I like that we can still kind of giggle in this, with this. Okay. There are other events of life that can spur on grief, not just the loss of somebody.
This is very true.
Right? So unexpected changes in life that may not have a traumatic start to that unexpected change, but that can also spur on grief, because sometimes your identity has to be either completely altered or brought into question. So you did share that potentially you would want to talk about this, about your experience. And so,
sure.
All right. Go ahead, Liz.
Take it away.
Take it away, Liz.
Well, I mean, if you think about that definition, deep sorrow related to a loss, active and tormenting, that can definitely be applied to a lot of different types of losses. And I think it's one of the things that is not, at least not where I grew up, super commonly talked about. Like, probably I would have heard get over it more than, let's grieve this loss. Or acknowledge it. Right? So, now, for me, in 2019, my dad got really sick, and it was like, felt out of nowhere, and he we did not know this at the time because they did not catch it, but he had a fever in his brain amongst some infection in other parts of his body. So, but the fever in his brain caused him to like just be delusional all the time. Like, he really was not himself. And what I thought was going to be 2 weeks ended up being a year and a half of him in and out of, in the hospital or in like nursing homes and rehabilitation facilities. But that whole time, I would say when did it start? It started right after the New Year, so January, right at the beginning of the year. I think it was until April that he started to kind of be. It was after they found the infection in his spine and brain and did the surgery. And so he actually has no memories of any of that.
Oh, wow.
Because his brain was gone. So he has no idea what happened, what we went through. So let me just say, I was trying to pick up the slack, I guess, of his job as pastor. And when the treasurer was like, hey, we need to pay our bills, and my dad couldn't tell us the passwords because he is like delusional and talking about the pickle on his foot and the balloon on the ceiling. And I'm like, nope, that's not there. Because he's like so out of it. I had to like hack his computer to like figure things out. It was just like one kind of thing after another. Slowly realizing, wow, this isn't just going to go away. Things are actually changing.
Right.
And it was like every step was a new disruptive revelation. At some point, I realized my dad is never going to be the same again. He's not going to go back to how he was.
He was still alive, but he wasn't the person you knew him to be.
Yes. Still alive. Did not die. But is not the same person. He's different. And I remember I had gone to counseling during this time, and when my counselor mentioned, like, yeah, it makes sense you're grieving, I was like, I didn't understand.
Right.
I'm like, grieving what? My dad's alive.
Yeah. Yes.
And
yeah.
we, you know, talked about it, and she was right. I went through a grieving process because my dad was the person I relied on, like, for anything and everything. I did not go to Google. I went to my dad. And so not being able to do that anymore was like, I had to become a real adult and figure things out all by myself and new. And I had to change things. And I think one thing that I also had to come to terms with later, like really after, I think one of the final pieces of grieving, I mean, it still kind of comes when I would normally like do something and ask my dad or talk to my dad or do this with my dad, and I can't anymore.
Yeah.
Because he's at home, he's recovered in so many ways, but there's still a lot of limitations from what he was like before.
Yeah.
Coming to grips with this is the answer to our prayer. This is what we prayed for. We don't get to complain that he's not the same person. We prayed for him to live, and he lived.
Right.
This is the answer to my prayer.
Yeah.
And I am grateful for it.
Right.
But there's been times where I was like, you know, when are we going back to normal?
Right.
And no, it's not going to go back to normal.
Yeah.
This is the answer.
Yeah.
And so I do give thanks to God for it.
Yeah.
But that was something I had to contend with. So, yeah.
Would you say that your identity in that circumstance was brought into question? Or
it completely disrupted my life.
Yeah.
The story is far too long for this already very long podcast. I had a total mental breakdown when finally, after like 3 months, I realized, oh my gosh, we are in this. Like, he is not better.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know how long he's going to be in the hospital. Somebody has to run this church, and it is looking like it's me.
Right.
And I did not ask for that. And
right.
I like locked myself in my house for a week and just like had anxiety and just laid there like unable to do anything. I could not leave. I did not take out my trash. I did not go grocery shopping. I just laid on my couch and like panicked.
Yes.
For all the way up until the day before I had to go back to work. And I was like, well, God, I don't know what to do. And I'm going to need your help. Because I feel like my choice is like to do this or to like quit life.
Right.
Like, I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
And interestingly, that immediately the Holy Spirit brought to mind this resource I had written down over a year ago and had not thought about again. And it was a website for a counselor. And I was like, oh, I'll get therapy. That will help. But I mean, think about that.
Yeah.
That's the thing. And now look, I'm a counselor now.
Yeah.
Like, it went from there to this.
I know.
I mean, it totally changed my life because I had to face the things in me that, like, let's just say the Lord had to burn away some chaff, man.
Right.
Like, I couldn't just be comfortable, or things were too different, and I needed to face the stuff that was getting in my way and that I was not having awareness about, and all the stuff.
That's, again, the kind of grief kind of just, oh man, like something unexpected or whatever, just makes everything kind of just, and leaves you, here you are. Who are you really? Like that's been my experience over and over with the different kinds of like, who, and then, so that totally, that's intense. Yeah,
the whole thing, I mean, it's a weird way to think about it. Like, when you're this many years away from something like that.
Right.
And you're like, wow, I went through the fire, but I like, so many things changed for the better for me.
Right.
It's weird to look back and be grateful.
I know. And that's what I was saying, like, earlier, I'm like, I feel kind of awkward saying that, but like, you know, even me, I just put this together the other day of, it's like my degree is in elementary ed. I've done overseas teaching and all this stuff. And then I started having a lot of health issues, and so then I started going back to school and became a health restoration coach, and now in school again, nutritional therapy practitioner. But like a lot of the stuff that I read has to do with the nervous system. The nervous system absolutely fascinates me, and it was not until just a few days ago that I was telling Derek, I'm like, hello, like my brother had nervous system, like he was in a neurologist's office all the time. He had neurologists from all over the world trying to figure him out. And I'm like, is it any wonder that I'm so fascinated by this stuff? Even though I'm just now putting this together, it did definitely, like, his life of, like, what could have been done differently. And that's maybe the other part with maybe grief. What could have been different?
Trying to, like, solve the problem.
Trying to solve the problem. Right. And looking at that, but from this side, like, I know my mom has thought something similar, and so it's pushed her to, listen to things differently.
Yeah.
But what comes to mind right now is, just for like a quick like snippet of information, is, we went, my mom and I went to this conference through the Wellness Way. Dr. Patrick Flynn, who's the founder, he was having his talk. And afterwards, he was signing books, and my mom walked up to him, and he has studied all different sorts of stuff. But she starts talking about my brother, who has already passed by this point, and he said, well, you need to look at his glutamate levels, which is a neurotransmitter. I will never forget. If somebody comes and tells me, hey, I'm going to always remember, if you have seizures and a hyperactive nervous system, check out your glutamate. Will it solve all your problems? I don't know, but it's an excitatory transmitter that tends to be very high in people with Parkinson's and seizures. So, hey, check out those levels. And then my mom said not one neurologist had told her we should look at glutamate.
Wow.
And so I'm not saying neurologists are bad or anything, but it's just when you've been through it, your ears are perked up for different kinds of information that you can assimilate in a different way. And so, it sounds like with your experience, it's kind of what happened of like, you would have gone through counseling, you would have become a counselor,
right? Which,
you've been complimented that the world needs more of you. But your experience is so unique too that you have that to go with. So, anywho, okay, real quick, one more type of things grief? That can bring about grief.
Okay.
Yes. Okay, so the last kind of event that we're going to look at, I don't know why I'm calling it event. I couldn't think of like a good word. Happening of life. I don't know. What we're going to, that can spur on grief is the loss of a childhood that you didn't have. Yeah. I'm going to say this one, I had it in my original script, befuddles me, and I'm bringing it back. This one is befuddling to me because I understand grieving over somebody you've lost or an unexpected change, and there's been a loss of something in that regards. And I think you've already explained how, like, for my childhood, I didn't have anything necessarily different. It just was my upbringing. It's what it was. So what exactly are you grieving if you've had not such a great childhood? What is that grieving like?
We have a presupposition here that, like, originally God created a perfect world. Yes. And in a perfect world, you would be raised by perfect parents who don't, like, make mistakes or hurt you. And obviously nobody grows up with that, even people who grow up with great parents. Right. But
there wasn't like any obvious kind of traumas occurring.
Yeah, there's definitely people out there, I feel like they're unicorns, but I know they exist. Yeah. That grow up with like healthy parents who know what they're doing. Yeah. Right? Or whatever, work through it if they don't. Yeah.
I want to be a unicorn. That's my goal.
Okay.
Honestly, one of my prayers is that God, please protect their hearts as I screw stuff up. Oof. That is it should be like every moment prayer, but like it's a frequent prayer. Yeah. And I believe that he can, because he has protected me. Like he has allowed me to grow a lot. Like there's been a lot of growth. I think more like a partnership where I put myself in positions and he's helped me work through these different things and stuff. But But truly, I do pray because I know I'm screwing stuff up, and because I am working through my own stuff, and so I do need him to do things I can't do. So
yeah.
Anyways, but yeah. So if you're lost in childhood presupposition that it wasn't supposed to be this way, that's not how God intended it, and so as believers, we were grieving more from like how God would grieve it. Like, this is his broken world, and we're living this brokenness.
Yeah, and I think sometimes people grow up with a abusive childhood or abusive home, and maybe they don't, it's so normal, they don't even realize. And I think it's the moment when you really realize what happened, or those years of neglect or whatever were actually not okay.
Right.
That sets off a grieving process.
Right. So that defense mechanisms that are in your brain, there for safety, can start. And if I remember correctly, it's like when you start feeling safe, that those things can start coming down, which is why you might become reactive, because that's scary, because you're starting to feel safe.
When you want to talk about grieving a childhood you never had, if you have that moment of realizing, I could have had a healthy childhood and I didn't, and that's not okay, which is true. It's okay to acknowledge that and still acknowledge, and I know my parents did the best they could at the time. That can definitely set off a deep sorrow related to a loss. And it can feel active and tormenting. And I think it would be maybe a mistake to not call it grief, because naming our emotions is powerful in how we move forward in processing them. And you don't have to call it grief. You could call it anger. You could call it maybe other things, identify specifically what you're feeling.
Yeah.
But if this is what you're feeling, this definition, then it could be helpful to identify it as grieving a loss of something you didn't have.
Yeah.
Because it is something that, from our biblical point of view, in the perfect world, we should have had.
Right.
And I know, I'm not saying that from an entitled place.
Right.
From like a just type of grief.
Right.
It's
Yes.
child abuse and neglect of all kinds are an injustice.
Right.
So it's okay to be angry about that. And to grieve. To grieve it.
Yeah. Yeah. Which, I'm slowly learning, but the first time that idea was presented, it just was very confusing to me. And I can't remember if it was you or I don't even know about like grieving. You need to grieve your childhood. It still hasn't fully clicked in my mind that there are things that need to be grieved over that are related to my childhood. And I'm gonna be honest, it feels like wrong. It feels like a betrayal to my family if I did that, if I said that.
I think a lot of people,
which is actually really interesting,
can relate to that.
Really?
Because we can see both things.
Right.
Like, we tend to love our children, especially. I mean, they will not snitch on their parents even when they are being so abused.
Right.
It's not ingrained in us. It feels like a betrayal.
Right.
We do love them, even when we're old enough to acknowledge that they've done serious wrong.
Right.
And it wasn't okay. So I can totally understand, and I think a lot of people relate to feeling like it's a betrayal, or I'm doing something wrong for being mad now.
Right. Yes.
It is possible, though, to feel what anger you do have.
Right. And
still acknowledge that you love your parents and not even have to involve them in the process.
Right.
Of the grieving.
Right.
Because your relationships have maybe hopefully moved on. Hopefully your parents have grown eventually, or whatever,
Right. Yeah. And even if they haven't, then, because, if they haven't, then just to be able to accept, like, this is still how I feel. This is still a struggle, and to say that that's what it is. It's what it is for me. And that was something in the Solo Shame book that was actually helpful, is that Dr. Thompson brings out different examples, and one of them is this kid who grew up in a seemingly really healthy home, where his parents were, teaching him hard work. We do our best and we do these things, and there was nothing obviously wrong, but he kind of went off the deep end for a bit, and it was just because he was grieving that he couldn't have his struggles brought out. Like, he was too scared to really talk about it because there was never space to really even do that.
Yeah.
And so stories like that kind of like, okay, so like you can be brought up in a home that is functional, but we're talking about the emotional part. Like, if you emotionally go through struggles and you as a child weren't comfortable talking about them to your parents, that's a red flag. Like, there was something going on that made you withhold that information. So it's probably still, if you never have dealt with it, it's probably still impacting you now.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So hopefully the big takeaway here throughout this conversation has been you can experience grief from various events, right? Not just the loss of somebody you love. It could be an unexpected event that has turned your world upside down. And more than likely, you've had to go through a grieving process of your identity and who, if it was a person involved, or maybe it wasn't a person. Maybe it was like all of a sudden you had to move, or I mean, we didn't even talk about it, but like the whole world shutting down, you know, was a big thing. All of a sudden, the things that we knew that was all being challenged, right? And so normalcy went out the door, and we again. Grief, and I'm coming back to that idea, and I really believe that grief of any sort just brings us back to such a small human point that we realize our smallness and our lack of control and how intimidating it can be to come to the point of I don't have any control over this, and that in itself kind of just, I don't know, so it's like a spiritual element as you're going through grief. And I don't know if that's true for all people, but I for sure would say people I have talked to, and my experience is very not just emotional or mental. There was a strong spiritual element throughout the processes as well.
Oh, for sure.
So anyway, so if you are walking through it now, or you are more on the healed side, I hope this conversation was helpful to you in some way. And any last words?
End the stigma on grief.
Let's end the stigma. Hashtag end the stigma.
Oh boy.
All right. Well, I do love that, like I said earlier too, that any kind of traumatic event, any kind of big emotional injuring kind of thing that occurs, doesn't have to stay stuck inside of you. That we can experience post-traumatic growth. And we're going to discover how that is in the nerd out moment. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, it's time for another nerd out moment. Covered a lot of things, a lot of heavier things. So let's just nerd out for a moment. Look at the science world who takes all the emotions out of stuff, and just look at some good information here. All right. When we're talking about the nervous system, we need to recognize neural pathways. So neural pathways are these super highways that are found throughout the body and the nervous system that forms all these connections that go from the mind to the body, or your brain structure, to everywhere else. The more often these pathways are used, the faster the communication within the nervous system happens. So when we think about habits, instincts, reactions, all of these are examples of neural pathways in action. You can think of also like when you practice a sport, that your muscle memory becomes greater and the reaction time becomes a lot better, right? So these are all examples, again, of these neural pathway creations. What's amazing about traumatic events of any sort, these create their own neural pathways. So again, trauma is anything that overwhelms the nervous system's ability to cope. When that happens, your nervous system creates new neural pathways, and these pathways can lead to the triggering of anxiety and these fight or flight responses. So when we encounter stressful circumstances of any kind, we actually have this opportunity to learn and grow from it. And that actually helps our nervous system to wire and rewire new neural pathways. So when we encounter these stressful circumstances and this ability for the body and the nervous system to adapt and change and create new pathways is called neuroplasticity. And this neuroplasticity allows for us not to remain stuck, but have new opportunities for growth. So when we encounter an emotional brain injury, it is actually best that our nervous system goes through some intense distress. I'm not sure if he's doctor, but Peter Levine, who wrote Waking the Tiger, talks about this as well, how our nervous system gears everything up, sends out all those neurotransmitters, so our body is geared up to do something, to fight, flight. If it can't do those, it gets overwhelmed and it freezes, right? So when we allow the system to actually become in that distress state, when we're talking about grief and the losing of somebody or something that's a part of our identity, then entering a distress state can actually set the stage and the opportunity for what's post-traumatic growth, as I learned in Before and After Lost. And I thought post-traumatic growth is such a cool term because we're familiar with post-traumatic disorder, but this is post-traumatic growth, which means in this distress state, our emotional brain is on fire, but it doesn't have to stay that way. Those neural pathways that have been created by the traumatic event, by the intense, stressful circumstance, can actually be recreated, rerouted, so that you experience intense growth afterwards. So once our automatic defenses calm down, things like the dissociation, once we're able to start getting the communication lines open again between that limbic system or the emotional brain and that prefrontal cortex, the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, all these areas of the brain, and once they can start talking again, then you can experience post-traumatic growth. Being vulnerable and honest with where you're at is actually the way you open up those lines of communication. So when the brain starts this pathway toward integration, when you start seeing, here's my emotional response, here's how I can think about this, your sympathetic responses can start to calm down, while your parasympathetic responses can start to kick back in. So again, the main carrier of those parasympathetic responses is your vagus nerve. Vagus nerve is attached to your heart, to your lungs, so your heart rate will see a change. Your lungs, you'll be able to breathe better, but also you might start seeing changes in your digestive health that were bothering you before. Okay, so grief actually, and any kind of stressful or traumatic event, has the opportunity for post-traumatic growth, which I think is just so cool. My hope is that after this conversation, you are feeling too overwhelmed. The point that we really want to highlight is that you can heal. That post-traumatic growth is totally possible. And it does tie into that, how you perceive things. And if you can perceive this and accept that you can grow from it, then you can. Okay? So Dr. Shulman in her book gives a lot of different examples of ideas to try out in order to support that post-traumatic growth. So she really gives a lot of helpful tips about journaling, and I've talked about journaling before. She goes into it way more. So I'm going to make a list of the ideas that she shares in the book for you to be able to see all those. I want to share a little bit about that, but she also gave some other insights that we can take away and other things that we can practice. The first thing is meditation. Now, meditation has an understanding. There's different points of view on how to see meditation. And more of like the Eastern point of view, it's all about emptying your mind. As a Christian, and from a Christian perspective, the Bible mentions meditation quite a bit. And it's all about filling your mind with things of God. And I really think that Philippians 4 is a great spot to go to, a passage of scripture. I mean, or throughout the Psalms. I mean, there are so many different options, but what I like about Philippians 4, it almost gives us like the guidelines for what we should meditate on. In general, though, the practice of meditation actually helps your brain to develop those neural pathways, helps to calm and enter more that parasympathetic state, that slow down, rest and digest state, but also it increases the brain areas that are in charge of focus and concentration, both of which suffer when you are in the process of grieving. So meditation can actually help develop those brain structures even better. The second recommendation Dr. Shulman tells us is to rely and trust those friendships you have built up and talk to your friends and talk to somebody. A trusted friend or trusted companion is really nice because they have been with you for a while, and you can be more vulnerable usually with that person. So that companionship is really important to show that you're not alone and our nervous systems actually interact. It's called neurobiological interactions. And so our nervous system depends on other people to help regulate. So you really do want to try to get around at least somebody that you feel comfortable with, that you feel safe with, so that if nothing else, their nervous system can help build up your own nervous system. Number 3 is journaling. Again, we've already talked about how journaling is great for communication, opening up the lines of communication between emotional brain and thinking brain. But Dr. Shulman does go through a lot of really practical guidelines or ideas that you can try. One thing she talks about is to make sure you're journaling in a way that makes sense for your particular personality. So if you don't really like to write, you don't have to write a bunch of stuff. If you like graphs, you can graph things instead. If you like sticky notes, put sticky notes everywhere and consolidate at the end of the day. So find something that makes sense for you. Other examples that you can journal, things that you can put in that journal. And again, I'm going to make a list for you. And this is all based on before and after loss. We can keep records of our dreams. In our dream world, our brains are consolidating. What is the consolidating emotions, things that are happening now, things that happened in the past. And so you can actually get some more ideas of what is going on mentally if you pay attention to your dreams. So she encourages to keep a dream journal. You can describe in a different journal, you can describe the personal meaning of the loss that you've experienced. You can make a list of things that will help you engage with your emotions, but also things that can help you distract and give you a break from dealing with the emotions. So you want to do both. So intentional engagement with the emotions, but then also taking a break from those. And then another idea is to examine and reflect on activities that give you a sense of comfort and in your journal. So there's things that you can really kind of hone into that gets it out from just fluttering around in your mind and really grasping it and writing it down, so you can come back to it later. A fourth thing you can do is exercise. So exercise is great for many different reasons. Moving your body is absolutely essential to health. In this case, though, it actually, when we're focusing on grief and its impact on the nervous system, and we talked about the brain injury, exercise will encourage blood flow, which encourages the nerve growth and proliferation and create all these new, networks of communication. So that's how we're going to be using exercise if you are talking about grief. The fifth thing is to try different therapies and see what works. She talks about group therapies or individual therapy, writing, just different things that you can use. There's music therapy, there's art therapy. So there's a lot of different kinds of therapy. Again, consider your personality and consider things that have worked for you in the past when you've been through something difficult and apply that here and see what happens. It may or may not help, but you tried something. Again, these are all suggestions that can help encourage you toward post-traumatic growth. And I will attest that it is absolutely possible, but you have to be willing to be vulnerable. You have to be willing to try things and put yourself in positions that you may really, really not want to be in, but it'll be to your benefit if you can. Okay, so if you try any of those things, hey, you can share it. Please comment and let us know what was very helpful for you and start building up this community. Okay? All right, well, that wraps up another episode. And the next one, we're going to explore mindsets, perceptions, and beliefs. Yup, still sticking with the nervous system. I promise you, we're almost there. We're almost there before we enter digestive talk. I look forward to you returning back. If you do have specific questions, please ask them so that I can make this podcast better for you and for the learning that you need to have and that you are wanting. All right, well, this time, I'm just Rachel. There is no Derek. And I am hoping to help you put the pieces of your health together. Talk to you soon.